The Vorath had a saying. Roughly translated, it meant, when a smaller creature speaks, check first if it is worth the air it wastes. They were not a cruel species, exactly. They were simply efficient, brutally, catastrophically, cosmically efficient at ignoring anything they considered beneath their cognitive pay grade. And humans? Humans were very much beneath their cognitive pay grade. To be fair, and I am trying very hard to be fair here, the Vorath had encountered 41 spacefaring civilizations before humanity stumbled onto the galactic stage. 41. Of those, 38 had been welcomed, assessed, catalogued, and quietly filed under moderately interesting but ultimately predictable. The remaining 3 had been, let's say, problems. The kind of problems that required orbital solutions and several centuries of collective therapy. So when the Vorath conclave first intercepted human transmissions, chaotic, overlapping, broadcasting 17 contradictory political ideologies simultaneously, while also somehow transmitting a cooking competition, their senior analyst, Counselor Dreveth Sine, pinched the bridge of his nasal ridge and said, and I quote, "Another manageable species." He would later have that phrase engraved on his retirement plaque. Not as a proud achievement, as a warning. It started, as most catastrophic misunderstandings do, with a meeting. The Galactic Conclave held its sessions on Thurvon Station, a structure so enormous that its shadow cooled entire moons. Representatives from 42 civilizations sat in tiered rings around a central forum, their translators humming, their patience varying wildly by species. Humanity's first official delegation arrived 40 minutes late because their shuttle pilot, a woman named Petra Okafor, had taken a detour to observe what she described as a genuinely spectacular nebula, and had not considered this worth mentioning until after the fact. The Vorath delegation, led by the immovable counselor Dreveth Sine himself, had noted this tardiness in 3 separate official logs before the humans even sat down. Petra, for her part, seemed utterly unbothered. She had the specific energy of someone who has survived enough genuinely terrible situations that a room full of disapproving aliens registers somewhere below mildly inconvenient. She took her seat, smoothed her jacket, glanced around at the towering alien architecture and said, quietly but not quietly enough to her colleague beside her, "Reminds me of the Brussels airport. Same vibe. Nobody looks happy." Her colleague, Dr. Femi Adora, a xenolinguist whose entire career had been building toward this moment, closed his eyes briefly in the manner of someone mentally revising their life choices. The conclave's agenda that session was the Dreveth Corridor, a navigational route cutting through the outer spiral that the Vorath had recently charted and claimed as a managed transit zone. 16 civilizations used it. 3 had concerns about the new toll structures. 2 had concerns about the new patrol regulations. And humanity, who had been spacefaring for less than 40 years and technically should not have had an opinion yet, had filed a formal objection 14 pages long, attached to a secondary document 47 pages long, which was itself attached to 3 appendices. Counselor Dreveth Sine had not read them. His aide, a young Vorath named Silith Var, had skimmed the summary and reported back that the humans seemed to believe there was a gravitational anomaly of concern in Sector 7 of the corridor. Dreveth Sine had nodded slowly and said, "The humans have been in space for 4 decades. We have been mapping this corridor for 3 centuries. Note their concern and file it." Silith Var had filed it. Alphabetically under H, between humidity complaints from the Farathi delegation and Hull Aesthetics petition unresolved. In the forum, when the floor opened for objections, Petra Okafor stood up. Now, I want you to understand something about Petra. She was not a diplomat by training. She was an astrophysicist who had been added to the delegation because she had written the 47-page document, and someone had reasoned correctly that she would be difficult to keep at home. She stood 5'4", wore her hair in tight coils that somehow always looked slightly wind-tossed, and had a quality that her colleagues described, depending on their feelings toward her, as either relentless or exhausting. She said, in the measured tone of someone who has explained something complicated many times and is now explaining it one final time with diminishing patience. Counselor. The harmonic resonance pattern in Sector 7 of the Dreveth corridor indicates a compound gravitational stress fracture. It is not visible on standard Voreth survey equipment because your survey equipment was calibrated in an era before you mapped the twin mass system behind the Cathara Veil. The fracture is propagating. We have been trying to submit this data for 6 months. Dreveth Sign looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone watching a household pet attempt to operate a door handle. Fond, slightly amused, and completely certain the situation would resolve itself without intervention, he said, "Humanity's contribution to galactic astrophysics is noted. The corridor has operated without incident for 3 centuries. We will continue to monitor using established protocols." Petra opened her mouth. Dr. Femi Adora gently placed his hand on her arm. She sat down. She did not look pleased about it. Over the next 4 months, the human delegation submitted 7 follow-up reports, each one more detailed than the last, each one containing updated modeling, new sensor data collected from a small unmanned probe they had quietly, without asking anyone's permission, which did become a separate diplomatic incident, positioned at the edge of the sector. The models were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. The Farathi delegate, a silvery scaled being named Counselor Osivith, had actually read the 3rd report and mentioned quietly to their own science team that the mathematics seemed sound and perhaps worth a second look. The Vorath filed this under Farathi concern, low priority. The Benari, a species who communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin, and who were therefore often underestimated in verbal forums, had sent their own probe after reading humanity's 2nd report. Their findings matched. Their chief scientist, a being whose name translated approximately as Lorvan of the Amber Current, submitted a joint endorsement of humanity's data to the conclave. The Vorath filed this under joint concern, cross-reference with human filing, low priority. Silith Var, Dreveth Sign's aide, had by this point read all 7 human reports in full. He had also read the Benari endorsement. He had also, late one station night when the offices were quiet, run the human calculations himself using a modeling suite he had downloaded specifically for this purpose. He sat at his desk for a long time afterward, looking at the numbers. Then he wrote a memo to Counselor Dreveth Sign. The memo said, in the precise and careful language of a junior official who is deeply aware that he is about to tell his superior something the superior does not want to hear, that he believed the human assessment warranted urgent review, that the stress fracture modeling appeared internally consistent and empirically supported, and that given the transit volume through Sector 7, the potential consequences of inaction were, and he chose this word carefully, significant. Dreveth Sign read the memo. He appreciated Silith Var's diligence. He noted that the young aide showed promise. He recommended that Silith Var take a few days of rest because clearly the long session schedule was affecting his judgment. He did not act on the memo. Petra Okafor, when Femi told her about a Vorath source who had quietly confirmed the conclave's internal response, said nothing for a very long time. She was sitting in the small observation lounge of the human residential section of Thurvan Station, watching a cargo freighter the size of a city block ease through the docking approach on the far side of the station. A Vorath freighter, running the Drevath corridor 6 times a week, along with hundreds of others, she said, eventually. How long do we have? Femi said. The latest model puts the fracture threshold at between 8 and 14 months. That's a wide margin, Petra said. So we have, best case, 14 months to make them listen. Or worst case, 8 months before we're right and everyone wishes we'd been wrong. Femi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there's a third option. We act ourselves. Petra looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has spent his career studying alien communication and has concluded that sometimes the most important message is the one you stop trying to ask permission to send, she said. Walk me through it. Here is where it gets interesting. And I mean that sincerely because up to this point you might fairly argue this is a story about bureaucracy. which is frightening in its own right but perhaps not in the cinematic sense. But what Femi Adewora had spent the last 3 months quietly doing in addition to his official diplomatic duties was building a network. Not a dramatic, shadowy network. Not anything that would make a good thriller poster. He had simply been talking to people. He had talked to Lorvan of the Amber Current of the Binari, who communicated in color and had very precise feelings about what it meant when evidence was ignored. He had talked to a Farathi engineer named Osiveth Tal, cousin to the counselor, operating entirely independently, who had her own concerns about the corridor and her own frustrated history of unread reports. He had talked to a Thurvan station maintenance supervisor named Bregat, a species called the Dulhari, who were squat and four-armed and had worked this station for 30 years, and who had noticed, because it was his job to notice, that the corridor-facing sensors in Sector 7 had been returning slightly odd readings for months, the kind of odd that maintenance supervisors log and no one else ever reads. And he had talked to a journalist. Her name was Vas Merica, and she worked for the Galactic Dispatch, which was not the most prestigious news organization in the known galaxy, but was arguably the most widely read one, because it had a philosophy of publishing things that other outlets politely declined to touch. Vas Merica had hair the color of a fire hazard. Genuinely, biologically, it was bioluminescent, and she had never felt the need to tone it down. And she had a laugh that could cut glass and a professional instinct for the moment when a story stopped being a story and started being a warning. Femi had sent her humanities first report 6 months ago, with a note that said simply, "Read the appendices." She had also done her own research. She had also, it turned out, been trying to reach Councillor Draveth Sign's office for 2 months and receiving, with impressive consistency, no reply. She was, as Femi had correctly assessed, ready. The plan was not complicated. The most effective plans rarely are. Femi and Petra would request one final formal audience with the conclave. Not to present new data. They had all agreed there was no point in more data, but to formally, on the record, in front of 42 civilizations, state exactly what they believed would happen, exactly when, and exactly why they had been unable to prevent it. Lorvan of the Amber Current would attend and formally second the statement. Osiveth Tal would provide independent engineering testimony. Bregat would submit his maintenance logs, and Vas Merica would broadcast all of it, live, to approximately 9 billion readers across 14 star systems. Councillor Draveth Sign received the request for audience on a Tuesday, by station reckoning, and approved it for the following session without reading the attached agenda, because his schedule manager had flagged it as routine. It was, to be precise, the least routine thing that had happened in that room in 40 years. The session began quietly enough, 42 delegations settling into their tiers, translators synchronizing, the low procedural hum of a conclave morning that expected nothing more demanding than toll disputes and boundary notations. Councillor Draveth Sign arrived exactly on time, which was his religion. Arranged his notes with the practiced serenity of a man who had presided over thousands of these sessions and expected to preside over thousands more, and nodded to his aide Silith Var, who nodded back with the specific expression of someone who knows exactly what is about to happen and has made peace with being unable to stop it. Petra Okafor arrived early. This was noted by several delegations as statistically unprecedented. She sat at the human table, with Femi Adewora beside her, and she did not fidget, did not review her notes, did not do anything except sit with her hands folded and watch Councillor Draveth Sign arrange his papers with the calm attention of a person who has decided, finally and completely, that patience has run its course. Femi, for his part, was sending a message. Not to anyone in the room, to Vas Merica, who was already positioned in the press gallery with 3 recording devices, and the particular stillness of a journalist who has been waiting a long time for a story to become undeniable. The session opened. Routine items moved through with customary efficiency. Then the human delegation was recognized. Petra stood. She said, "Councillor Draveth Sign, members of the conclave, I am going to do something today that is not standard diplomatic practice. I am going to stop asking. The room did what rooms do when something unexpected happens. It went very, very quiet, she continued. For 8 months, humanity has submitted formal data indicating a propagating gravitational stress fracture in Sector 7 of the Dreveth Corridor. We have submitted 7 reports, 47 pages of primary modeling, 3 appendices, and 1 independently corroborated binary endorsement. We have been told, repeatedly and consistently, that our data is noted. I am here today not to submit more data. I am here to state, on the official record of this conclave, that we believe the fracture will reach critical threshold within 6 to 10 weeks, that a cascade failure at that threshold will produce a gravitational shear event affecting approximately 400 kilometers of navigable corridor, and that the average daily transit volume through that sector means a shear event of that magnitude will destroy between 11 and 30 vessels depending on traffic timing. She paused. The quiet in the room had become a different kind of quiet. The kind that has texture, she said. We have tried to prevent this through proper channels. The proper channels have not worked. So I am telling you now, plainly, in front of everyone, so that when it happens, the record is clear about what was known and when. She sat down. Dreveth Sign had the expression of a very senior official who has just realized that the domesticated creature he has been managing has, at some point he cannot precisely identify, stopped being manageable. He said, measured and cool. The conclave appreciates the human delegation's continued dedication to this matter. Our survey teams remain confident in the corridor's structural integrity based on 3 centuries of Lorvan of the Amber Current stood. When a Binari stands to speak in a formal session, their skin shifts. It is involuntary, part of their communication architecture, older than any language they have translated for galactic use. Lorvan went, in the span of 3 seconds, from their resting pale gold to a deep, burning amber shot through with streaks of sharp white. Every other species in that room who had spent any time around Binari knew, immediately and viscerally, what that color combination meant. It was the Binari equivalent of a very calm person setting their coffee down slowly before saying something that cannot be unsaid. Their translator rendered it as, the Binari continuum formally seconds the human assessment in full. Our independent survey data is identical in all significant projections. We also note, for the record, that we submitted our endorsement 4 months ago and received no substantive response. We consider this moment a failure of this body's core function, and we say so now because we will not be able to unsay it afterward. Osivith Tal, who did not have an official seat on the floor but had been granted observer status, stood in the gallery tier and said, without waiting to be formally recognized because she had decided approximately 3 weeks ago that formal recognition had its limits, independent Farathi engineering assessment concurs with human stress fracture modeling. I can provide the calculations. I will provide them whether asked or not. Breget, the Dolhari maintenance supervisor, did not stand. His species did not speak in formal sessions. It was not their custom. But Femi had his maintenance logs queued and transmitted them to the floor display before anyone thought to wonder whether that was procedurally allowed. 14 months of Sector 7 sensor anomalies appeared on every screen in the room in crisp, patient columns. Numbers did not care about procedure. They just sat there being correct, and in the press gallery, Voss America's broadcast went live to 9 billion people, which is a very large audience to have for the moment when an institution realizes it has made a significant error. Dreveth Sign said nothing for a long time. Silith Var, who had written a memo that had not been read and had spent 4 months quietly hoping he was wrong, looked at the floor display and looked at his superior and felt something that his species would describe as the specific grief of a correct prediction you desperately wanted to be incorrect. The conclave went into emergency session. Dreveth Sign, to his credit, and I will give him this credit because it matters, did not deflect, did not demand procedural review, did not request a subcommittee. He looked at the numbers on the screen, and he looked at Silith Var, and he said, "Close the corridor, now." It took 11 minutes to issue the closure order. 11 minutes from the moment Dreveth sign said those 3 words to the moment automated signals went out to every vessel in or approaching the Dreveth corridor. Traffic control on 6 stations scrambled simultaneously. 214 vessels were rerouted in the following 4 hours. 47 that had already entered the corridor were guided out under emergency transit protocols by a joint operation that, by the end of it, had involved 17 different species navigation teams working in a coordination nobody had technically planned, but everyone somehow managed. The fracture reached critical threshold 19 days later. I want to be precise about what happened, because precision matters here, and because some accounts have been, let's say, cinematic in ways that sacrifice accuracy for drama, which is unnecessary because the accurate version is already extraordinary. The gravitational shear event in Sector 7 lasted approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The corridor in that section was rendered completely impassable. The shear propagated across a 430-kilometer stretch and, at its peak intensity, produced gravitational differentials that would have reduced any vessel caught inside to components too small to catalog. Nobody was inside. The corridor was empty, because 11 minutes of decisive action 19 days prior had made it empty, because 8 months of ignored warnings had finally, at the last possible moment, been heard. Vos Merica, watching the sensor feed from Thurvan Station alongside approximately 9 billion other people, wrote a single line in her broadcast before beginning her full report. She wrote, "They told us. We have the timestamps. The political consequences took longer than 19 days. They always do. The formal conclave inquiry lasted 7 months, which by the standards of galactic governance is considered breakneck speed and speaks to the specific quality of urgency that 9 billion live viewers tends to produce. Councillor Dravath Sign did not resign, but he also did not seek reappointment when his term ended, and he spent the remaining years of his public life advocating, with what colleagues described as almost compulsive dedication, for a new protocol requiring mandatory independent review of any data submitted by a member species and rejected more than twice without documented technical justification. The protocol was named the Okafor Lorvan Provision. Petra, when she heard this, laughed for a long time. Not the pleased laugh of someone receiving an honor, the helpless laugh of someone confronting the specific absurdity of the universe, which had required them to spend 8 months shouting into a bureaucratic void and nearly watch hundreds of people die before arriving at the conclusion that perhaps submitted evidence deserved to be read. She told Femi it was the most exhausting compliment she had ever received. He told her she should put it on her door. She did not put it on her door. Silith Var was promoted, eventually, to a senior analyst position in the Conclave's new independent review office. He was considered unusually thorough, with a particular habit of reading every appendix personally regardless of length, which his colleagues found excessive and which he considered, privately and permanently, the absolute minimum standard. He kept the memo he had sent to Dreveth Sign, the one that had gone unread, not as a grievance but as a reminder. On the days when the review work felt tedious, when the reports piled up and the models blurred together, and it was tempting to file something under low priority and move on, he would look at it. It was, he had concluded, the most important document he had ever written, not because it had changed anything, because it hadn't, and because the difference between that outcome and the corridor being full of ships when the fracture hit was 11 minutes and one person finally deciding to stop asking. Osaveth Tal received a formal commendation from the Farathi Science Council for her independent testimony, which she accepted with the specific expression of a person who would have preferred the recognition arrive before the near catastrophe rather than after, but who understood that this was apparently how recognition worked, and had adjusted her expectations accordingly. Lower Van of the Amber Current returned to the Benari Continuum and delivered a report to their governing council that was, by Benari standards, extraordinary. In color terms, it was almost entirely amber, the color of urgency, interrupted by long sections of deep violet, which was the color they used for conclusions that had been reached the hard way. The report's central argument was that the galactic community had developed a habit of measuring the credibility of a species' data against the age of that species in space, and that this was not only a logical error but a dangerous one, because the universe did not calibrate the severity of its gravitational fractures to the seniority of whoever noticed them first. The report was read widely and immediately by almost everyone it was sent to. Lorvan noted this timing with the dry precision of a scientist who has been paying attention. As for humanity, well, here is where I will tell you something that the official conclave records note in careful diplomatic language, and that I will tell you plainly, because I think you deserve the plain version. Humanity did not become suddenly respected overnight. The galaxy is large and old and full of species that have been managing their impressions of each other for millennia, and 8 months of ignored warnings followed by a corridor closing emergency, however dramatic, does not rewire 41 civilizations' instincts about a species that was late to its first conclave session because its pilot stopped to look at a nebula. What changed was smaller than that, and more durable. Because Silith Var read the appendices now. Because Osaveth Tal had standing in the Farathi technical community that she had not had before, and she used it to build a cross-species early warning working group that met quarterly and had a strict policy of reading everything submitted regardless of the submitting species' galactic tenure. Because Breget, the maintenance supervisor, received 3 separate requests from different stations, asking him to train their own maintenance teams on his sensor anomaly logging protocol, which he found slightly baffling because he had simply been doing his job, which was his point exactly. That was the entire point. The job was worth doing properly. And because Vos Merica, whose broadcast had been watched by 9 billion people in 14 star systems, had received, in the weeks after the corridor event, more messages than she could count from scientists and engineers and analysts of a dozen species who had data sitting in review queues and reports filed under low priority and concerns logged and cross-referenced and quietly, patiently going nowhere. She published all of them, every single one. She started a column. She called it, with characteristic restraint, the appendices. It became, within a year, the most read scientific journalism publication in the known galaxy. Petra Okafor eventually returned to astrophysics full-time, which she had wanted to do since approximately the 2nd month of her diplomatic assignment. She was back on a research station when she identified the next anomaly. Different sector, different mechanism, same patient, building pattern of something structural behaving in ways that standard equipment wasn't quite catching. She wrote it up, filed it with the Conclave's new independent review office, marked it urgent. Silith Ver read it the same day it arrived. He cross-referenced it with the Binari Sensor Network, contacted the Farathi Working Group, and had a multi-species assessment team deployed within a week. The anomaly turned out to be real, minor, and entirely manageable with early intervention. No emergency session, no live broadcast, no near catastrophe. Just a problem caught early by people who had decided that the cost of reading carefully was considerably lower than the cost of not reading at all. Petra got a notification when the assessment team confirmed her findings. She was in the middle of a different calculation, something completely unrelated, and she paused when the message came through. She read it, set it down, went back to her calculation. She did not laugh. She did not rage. She just kept working, which was what she had always done, and what she would always do, and what had made her right the first time and every time after that. The Vorath had a saying, roughly translated, when a smaller creature speaks, check first if it is worth the air it wastes. They retired that saying, not officially, not in any ceremony or proclamation. It simply stopped being said. The way things stop being said when the generation that said them has lived long enough to understand, with the particular clarity that near disasters provide, that the thing they were saying was not wisdom, it was just noise. And the universe, as it turned out, had far more interesting things to listen to.